Welcome to Week 3. This is the first of what will be a series of weekly mini-lectures on the CLS 100 content. This week, we're covering Chapters 4 and 5 from your textbook, the chapters on Connect and Think. As we go through the material, remember the primary topics that we're covering this week are information literacy in Chapter 4 and critical thinking in Chapter 5. So at the end of this week, you should have a better understanding of both of those topics. The first thing I want to talk about from Chapter 4 is some tips for working online. One of the most important things to remember about working online is separating your social time from your work time. So work first, then reward yourself with play. But make sure you actually set aside some time for play, otherwise you end up cutting into your work time with it. Some things that you can do to make sure that you're effective in your online work time is avoid signing in to things like Facebook or Twitter or instant messenger programs when you're actually supposed to be working. And sometimes it can even be helpful to let your friends know when you're working and when you're socializing so that when you are working, they don't disturb you or try to send you messages and things like that. One of the tips that's on the slide that you'll see here is making a plan and sticking to it. So if you say, I'm going to set aside 2 hours a day for working online between the hours of 4 and 6, actually do it. Stick to that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about technology and education. So on Figure 4.2, on pages 86 and 87 of your textbook, it outlines a number of different technology tools. And the thing that I want you to sort of take away from thinking about these tools is that the key is usage of the tools. One of the common mistakes that people make is they treat applications and tech tools as if they're either educational or they're not. But in reality, almost any tool can be used for learning. It may just be that we don't typically use them that way. So if you look at something like Facebook, you can use Facebook to coordinate group work. You can use Facebook as a substitute for discussion boards. With something like Twitter, you can use Twitter as a way for students to provide instant feedback on a course by creating a hashtag for a particular lecture. So really the usage is the key. And I would encourage you to take a look at Chapter 4 because it does provide some useful information on the different tools and also some tips for effective internet searches. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of navigating that information here in a couple minutes. The next issue that I want to touch on is online privacy and security. If you look at our sort of current generation, one of the things that you'll see is that online privacy is a huge concern, and nothing online that's posted is truly private, and much of it stays saved on servers for years and years. So the careless things that you may post online out of anger or just out of poor judgment now can come back to haunt you years later. So just be aware of your online presence. On this slide, you can see some different tips and some issues. You've probably heard some of these before, but it's important to try to create strong and unpredictable passwords. Don't share or record your passwords. Be careful about posting photos online. Only enter personal information on secure websites. Don't post your whereabouts online. So if you look at apps like Foursquare or Swarm or even the things on Facebook that allow you to kind of track where you're at, be careful with that. I've actually heard stories about situations where thieves will see that someone's on vacation and then they go and they break into their house. Also install and run security software regularly. Beware of phishing schemes, different schemes to try to kind of get malware on your computer and things. And if you happen to have children, make sure you monitor their internet use closely. Kids nowadays are a lot more savvy than you might think, and so just be careful what they're doing. The next thing I want to talk about before we get into information literacy is e-communication. In the orientation for the course, I had you look at some information on netiquette, or rules for interacting with others online. Your textbook also explains some additional guidelines, and I've put them on this slide for you. The key here is to be careful. Putting things in print gives them a permanence that spoken words may not have. So just be careful about the things you communicate online. And if you look at some of these tips on this slide, e-communication is never private. Oftentimes, corporate email accounts are monitored. Those things are saved on servers that you don't have access to. So whenever you put something in print in an e-communication, it's never completely yours. Also, be sure to convey emotion along with words. Some of you probably had situations where you texted something to someone and it was misunderstood because it is hard to communicate emotion. A couple of these others, like thinking before responding, the 24-hour rule, it basically is the idea that if you type up an email or a text message and it's something that you're doing when you're in a kind of a really emotional state, let it sit for 24 hours. And if after 24 hours it's still something you want to send, then maybe it's okay. But don't send things out of anger, or out of emotion, or in a reactive state. Also, avoid hitting reply to all. It's a common mistake. Sometimes you end up sending things to 1,000 people and you didn't mean to. And also, texting language is not okay in academic or professional correspondence. So just think about that and how it sort of reflects on you. Okay. Now we're going to get into the sort of main topic for this chapter, which is information literacy. So when you think about all of this information online that we've talked about, information literacy is essentially about the skills a person needs to determine what information is needed, where to find it, how much of it's needed, how to analyze it, and finally how to properly cite it. A few months ago, I heard an executive who works in Apple's educational division speak about how professors are really no longer the ones that hold knowledge. We merely curate it. I mean, the fact is, if you have a smartphone, you have a wealth of knowledge in your pocket. But the problem is, there's so much of it that it's difficult to navigate that content to see where it's useful. That's where information literacy comes in, and ultimately that's what your professors and your instructors and teachers will do, is they help you kind of develop the tools to navigate all of that information. And the simple system that your textbook uses for that is the DARTS system, which essentially is determine, access, read, transform, and select. So in other words, you determine the info you need by narrowing your topic, you access the information from a variety of sources, you read and evaluate the information for accuracy and credibility, you transform the information to create your project, and then finally you select the appropriate documentation style. If you look at pages 105 through 107 in your book, there's an extensive guide for using the DARTS system. I'm not going to go over it all in this short video, but I would encourage you to take a look at it, maybe even make copies of it and use it in your other classes, because it's a great reference for just getting started with your research projects. So, those are the basics of Chapter 4, which talk about technology and information literacy. So now we'll move on to Chapter 5, which is ultimately about critical thinking. So if you look at critical thinking is one of the most important transferable skills you can develop. If you think about times in your life where things went poorly, you can usually identify some flaws in your thought processes around that area. And that's where critical thinking comes in. Critical thinking can help in many areas, and several of them are listed here on this slide. They can help you focus on relevant issues and problems, gather information, understand and organize thoughts and facts, analyze problems, manage your priorities. They assist in problem solving, producing new knowledge, determining accuracy of information, and detecting bias in persuasion and argument. And so if you think of those things, you can sort of break them down to an 8-step process. And for me, just a little background on me, one of my education originally when I was in college was in journalism, and sort of as a result of that, I kind of tend to think of things in terms of the journalist's 6 questions. So I'm always thinking about kind of who, what, when, where, why, and how with things. And so when I look at issues, oftentimes I'm kind of naturally drawn to think of the why and the how. And so if the last slide kind of tells us the why of critical thinking, this slide outlines the how. So essentially critical thinking involves 8 steps. You can see them on this wheel, and I'm going to avoid reading them all right now because the next thing I want to do is look at each one of them in a little more detail. So step 1 involves emotional intelligence. And if you don't know what emotional intelligence is, it essentially involves having the ability to read people's emotional states and tailor your responses to them. When I was in college, I actually took a class on emotions, and it was amazing to learn how much they affect our lives and how much emotional intelligence is tied in with our own success. And if you kind of want to know what emotional intelligence is, think about a situation where someone, and maybe that someone was you, responded in a way that may have been completely logical, but was still extremely insensitive. That's what low emotional intelligence looks like. And so not surprisingly, if you think about that, EI has been linked to a number of different things in the research. And so some of the ones we see on this slide are personal achievement, career success, leadership, life satisfaction. And it's as powerful of a predictor of success as intelligence. So if you're extremely intelligent, but you're very poor at reading emotions, it can be a real problem. Step 2 in critical thinking is to look at things differently. So if you look at this slide, looking at things differently involves things like looking at common issues with uncommon eyes, known problems with new skepticism, everyday conflicts with probing curiosity, daily challenges with attention to detail, and clues and patterns. And really what all of these get at is they get at the idea that critical thinking requires us to recognize our biases and our frames and to try to see things from multiple perspectives. So if you take your initial response to something, you should always ask, what am I missing? How might someone else see this? So step 3 of the 8 involves asking questions and tolerating uncertainty. And if you look at questions, there are essentially 3 types of questions that we can ask. And one of the things they talk about in your textbook is that it's oftentimes the questions that are more important than the answers. And if any of you have ever had children, I know that my 7-year-old loves to ask questions. She questions everything. And I think that's interesting because what it shows is that all of us are wired to be curious. We have a natural tendency to ask questions, and that tendency actually helps us survive because it helps us to understand situations and kind of try to identify things that could harm us. So in critical thinking, you need to look at questions of fact, preference, and judgment, and use the information you get from asking those questions in your decision-making and problem-solving processes. Which brings us to step 4, which is the problem-solving process. So if you look at this process, it's actually sort of a process within a process. Problem-solving fits within the critical thinking process. And this is something that alone could involve an entire discussion by itself. But I'm not going to do that in this short video. But if you look here, you've got a 5-step process. And basically what we do in problem solving is we try to understand the problem and develop some potential solutions. And what that typically involves is digging down to find the root of the solution, coming up with some potential solutions, or getting at the root of the problem, coming up with some potential solutions, testing those solutions against some criteria, and then deciding which of those solutions are going to meet the criteria most effectively. Step 5 in critical thinking is making intelligent decisions. On pages 125 through 127, they talk about this and give more detail. In essence, intelligent decision making is really more art than science, but it's an important art. The key is to try to avoid letting our emotions swallow us up and drive our decision making. Using logical reasoning and things like cost-benefit analyses help us find the best courses of action for things. It doesn't mean that all the decisions will be easy, but if you can do that, if you can stay grounded, look at the costs, look at the benefits, at least it gives you some assurance that maybe you're making wise choices. Step 6 involves distinguishing fact from opinion. If you look at the difference between these two things, a fact is something that can be objectively verified, whereas an opinion has no objective proof. And if you're trying to distinguish these things from one another, take nothing for granted, consider who's making the assertion, and listen for what is not said. That simple criterion is that if something can't be objectively verified, it's probably someone's subjective opinion. And when we start to treat opinions like facts, we often make poor decisions. Step 7 is seeking the truth in arguments and persuasion. I didn't put a lot on this slide, just kind of directed you to avoiding fallacious arguments, which are discussed on pages 128 and 129. If you take a look at these, all of them involve arguments that sound good on the surface, but really aren't accurate or ethical. You see these all the time in advertising. And if you're a critical thinker, you have to have the ability to sort them out. So if you look at just a couple examples, one of them is ad hominem, which is where you initiate a personal attack on someone rather than listening to and rationally debating his or her ideas. As we come into an election season, this is something you see in political debates all the time. The bandwagon technique, which is where you try to convince someone to do something just because everyone else is doing it. It's sort of the peer pressure thing. Sometimes those arguments can be compelling, but the fact is they substitute faulty logic for real logical reasoning, and that's a problem. So in critical thinking, you have to recognize those and avoid them. Finally, step 8 is creative thinking. Creative thinking involves producing something that's uniquely yours, and it requires internal resourcefulness. There are several characteristics that your book lays out, and you can look at those in more depth on your own. But essentially, the culmination of critical thinking is when you can take all this information that you've pulled together to create your own unique solution. Anyone can latch onto a prepackaged solution. Good critical thinkers create new solutions to problems. Okay, that's it for week 3. I'll post a series of starter threads for you in the discussion boards to give you a chance to discuss some of this material in more depth with your classmates. Also, don't forget to do your practice work and assessments for the week. I will see you next week.